El imposible realizado. 30º Festival Internacional de Poesía de Medellín.
Buenas tardes en Colombia y en el continente americano, a todas las personas que están en este momento conectadas desde cualquier lugar del mundo. Reciban un fraternal saludo desde el 30º Festival Internacional de Poesía de Medellín. Hoy damos continuidad a la celebración de sus 30 años con otro encuentro poético de gran relevancia dentro de estos 70 días de actividades continuas que comenzaron el 1 de agosto y finalizan el 10 de octubre. Es un honor poder presentar en esta ocasión al poeta estadounidense Bruce Weigl y al pequeño pero dedicado equipo profesional que acompaña esta emisión, entre ellos el lector e intérprete de obra. Les cuento que esta 30ª versión del Festival Internacional de Poesía de Medellín puede ser vista en nuestro canal de YouTube, desde nuestra página de Facebook y nuestro sitio web www.festivaldepoesiademedellin.org, donde también podrán acceder a toda la información de los 200 poetas invitados provenientes de los 103 países y todas las actividades ya realizadas y las que están por suceder. Les recordamos también que nuestro 30º Festival Internacional de Poesía de Medellín es posible gracias al apoyo de la Alcaldía de Medellín y su Secretaría de Cultura Ciudadana, el Ministerio de Cultura de Colombia y su Programa Nacional de Concertación Cultural, la Fundación Right Livelihood Award y los amables espectadores que nos vienen siguiendo. Si bien todas las lecturas que hemos tenido durante estos 39 días se han caracterizado por esa dosis de belleza que deja la poesía y el encuentro en torno a la palabra, hoy tendremos la oportunidad especial para entrar en contacto con dos naciones, Estados Unidos y Vietnam, que en un momento difícil de su historia compartida sufrieron la desaveniencia de la guerra y que en la actualidad podría decirse son dos naciones hermanas. El encuentro que ustedes están por presenciar tiene como invitado a un poeta estadounidense, Bruce Weigl. Y a las 7 p.m. hora Colombia tendremos al poeta vietnamita Nguyen Quang Thieu, quien también es vicepresidente de la Asociación de Escritores de Vietnam. No se necesitan demasiadas palabras para entender la belleza de este pequeño pero significativo hecho, ni se necesitan grandes conocimientos históricos para establecer una relación entre sustantivos, Vietnam y Estados Unidos. Creemos que es la poesía misma la que une el corazón de los poetas y que debería ser el mismo fuego de esa poesía el que una los nuestros. Quiero presentarles al poeta que nos acompañará esta tarde. Él se llama Bruce Weigl, nació en Oberlin, Ohio, Estados Unidos, en 1949. Es nieto de inmigrantes. Participó en la guerra de Vietnam en 1965 y 1968, lo que dejó una honda huella en su vida y en su obra. Desde hace largo tiempo, él teje lazos de hermandad con los poetas vietnamitas. Su libro de poesía más reciente, On the Shores of the Welcome Home, de 2019, ganó el premio de poesía Isabella Gardner. Anteriormente, Weigl publicó La abundancia de la nada, uno de los 3 libros finalistas del premio Pulitzer en poesía en 2013. Publicó también una memoria, El círculo de Han, en el año 2000, así como más de 25 obras de poesía, ensayos y traducciones del vietnamita y el rumano. Bienvenido, Bruce. ¿Cómo has estado?
Thank you for your kind words. And let me say, please, that I'm very happy to be here with you. I wish I could be in Medellín to read my poems, but I'm grateful that we have this opportunity today.
Bueno, el poeta agradece por su presencia aquí, dice que le encantaría estar en Medellín con nosotros ahora mismo y bueno, pues aquí está, digamos, como con toda su energía.
I'm going to read poems today from a collection that will be out next year.
Va a leer unos poemas de un libro que se llama Conexiones con el Nuevo Año.
And I'm going to begin with the first poem in that collection called Tale of the Tortoise.
Y va a empezar con el primer poema llamado El cuento de la tortuga.
I don't know how the tortoise got in through the fence and past the neighborhood dogs that run loose once the sun is down, but I found her near a nest of her eggs where the garden had already begun to turn to autumn. It seemed she'd found a home there, and who was I to tell her otherwise? So I brought her straw to make a better bed, and food I never saw her eat, but that disappeared from the tin plate where I put it. I don't remember now how long it took, but she kept the eggs warm until they hatched, and her many babies scrambled out in every direction until she rounded them up again into her care. Now I have to tell you that there never was a tortoise, only one that I wanted to be there. There never was a fence to crawl under or neighborhood dogs for someone to step around down in the dark alley. There was no dark alley. There was no nest or eggs, no straw, no hope for anything. But I did find a tortoise in my yard one morning where it had laid its eggs in a nest it had made with mowed grass. I don't know where she came from, but perhaps she was a neighbor's pet and there was a zoo nearby. I called the police to see if they knew what to do, and they came quickly and confirmed that it was a tortoise with eggs. Sometimes you need to tell the story to fill a hole in your mind or to try and mend something that's been torn by a violent wave that washed through you once. There was no tortoise, no policeman. I know. I have to stop doing this. I want you to believe me. It's all about the story. It's all we have.
El cuento de la tortuga. No sé la tortuga cómo logró meterse por la cerca, ni cómo evadió los perros del barrio que corren sueltos una vez que cae el sol, pero la encontré cerca de un nido con sus huevos, donde el jardín ya se transformaba para el otoño. Parecía que había encontrado su sitio propio ahí, y quién era yo para contradecirla. Así que le compré paja para que se hiciera un lecho mejor, y nunca la vi comer, pero desaparecía lo que le dejaba en un plato de hojalata. No me acuerdo cuánto se demoró, pero calentó los huevos y nacieron, y sus muchos bebés corrían en todas las direcciones hasta que ella los acorralaba de nuevo donde los podía cuidar. Ahora te tengo que decir que nunca hubo una tortuga, solo la que yo hubiera querido que estuviera. Nunca hubo una cerca por donde meterse, ni perros para evadir en el callejón oscuro. No hubo callejón oscuro. No hubo nido ni huevos, ni paja, ni la esperanza de nada. Pero sí encontré una tortuga en mi solar una mañana donde había puesto sus huevos en un nido que había hecho de hierba podada. No sé de dónde vino. Zoológico cerca. Ellos sabrían qué hacer. Llegaron rápido. Confirmaron que era una tortuga con huevos. A veces uno tiene que contar un cuento para llenar el hueco que tiene en la mente o para remendar algo que ha sido roto por una ola violenta que pasó por uno alguna vez. No hubo tortuga y no hubo policías. Yo sé, tengo que dejar de hacer esto. Quiero que me creas. Todo tiene que ver con el cuento. Es lo único que tenemos.
Thank you. This is called The Man in the Chair. The man in the chair is screaming his life away. No one cares that his bathrobe has fallen open, exposing the white skin of old age. No one cares that he's screaming until the screams float down the hallway and then out into the night that cares even less. The maple trees I'm watching die have so much more freedom in their dying than the man in the chair. Someone who looks like me whispers in his ear that it will be all right, but for now he doesn't stop screaming. Each scream, a wave that comes from far away, then breaks onto our rocky shore. I don't know if the maple trees know that they are dying. Nothing can be done. So I watch them die and trim the dying branches and carry them away. The man in the chair wants someone to carry him away. He won't stop screaming in the nursing home where my demented mother keeps her eyes closed but manages a shut up on her own. This is what a life may come to after all. This is what a life is and means and smells and tastes and sounds like.
El hombre en la silla. El hombre en la silla desperdicia su vida a grito. A nadie le importa que su bata de baño está abierta, revelando la piel blanca de la vejez. A nadie le importa que está gritando hasta que sus gritos flotan por el corredor. Luego salen a la noche, que le importan aún menos. Los arces que observo morir tienen mucha más libertad en sus muertes que el hombre en la silla. Alguien que se parece a mí le susurra en el oído que todo va a estar bien, pero por el momento no para de gritar. Cada grito es una ola que viene desde lejos y luego se rompe sobre nuestra costa rocosa. No sé si los arces saben que están muriendo. Nada que hacer, entonces los observo morir y podo las ramas muertas y me las llevo. El hombre en la silla quiere que alguien se lo lleve. No dejará de gritar en el asilo donde mi madre demente logra decir cállate sin ayuda de nadie. A esto es a lo que puede llegar la vida después de todo. Esto es lo que es la vida, lo que significa y a lo que huele, sabe y suena.
The problem with shapes in the night trees. On guard duty one night, and as stoned as I could be, I took my place, mumbled to the guy I was replacing, and settled into my position. The same thing was happening all up and down the perimeter, so there was more noise than there should have been. But soon things quieted down, and after a few more minutes, I looked out at the rice fields that stretched out like a graveyard as far as I could see. I'd done this before and sometimes under much more duress, but the Vietnam reefer had a hold of me, so I was reeling a bit and glad I could sit down. I needed to focus, so I squinted into the dark to get my night vision straight. At first, I could only barely make out the line between where the rice fields ended and the sky began, but as my eyes became more and more accustomed to the dark, I began to see more details. I looked and shook my head and looked again. I saw an entire platoon of Viet Cong soldiers moving almost imperceptibly in my direction through the dark, which was everyone's direction, and my simple duty to defend, my sacred duty to defend the LZ, which I did with all of my heart. I needed to alert the guy down the line, but I couldn't see him in the dark, and I didn't want to make any noise, not a sound. The problem with dark shapes in the night trees is that sometimes they're bodies. I squinted again into the dark rice fields and put my nose to the breeze until I saw that the Viet Cong were water buffalo easing through my line of fire, so I could be easy as well and breathe again. But that's not the end of the story, because someone down the line at 3 a.m. pulled his claymores when some trip flares lit up our position, and I heard the sputter of rifle fire nearby, all up and down the line. As the trip flares lit up our position, and I heard the sputter of rifle fire nearby, all up and down the line, trip flares descended among us, and you could see the shapes of water buffalo in that too sharp light, here and there, and then so quickly gone. A few more rounds cracked, and then it was quiet again, so I could hear a frightful bellowing coming from the darkness. Sharp cries that sounded a lot like pain to me. All I could do was stay in my position and hope whatever it was would die soon, so the sounds of its dying would stop, and maybe that would be the end of it for the night. It's from our links with other things that memory occurs. That's why they won't let go sometimes, no matter what you think or pray. The farmer found the bodies even before first light and dragged one calf to our bunker. Its eyes were still open, so it seemed to look at me, I thought, its still gaze including me in the difficulty surrounding us all. I was 18 years old and didn't know much. I heard some voices raised in anger in the background. Money was involved, and then some deals made, I think, that would allow everyone safe passage out of the wreck of waste the war had become. But I wasn't thinking about that. I was thinking about the bawling sound the calf had made after being torn to shreds by the claymore when it tripped the flares in its playful romping just off some ancient path through the rice. How human the voice had sounded, and how full of longing for peace, any kind.
El problema con las formas en los árboles de noche. Una noche en mi turno de guardia y drogado hasta ya no más, tomé mi puesto, le balbuceé algo al tipo que estaba reemplazando y me acomodé. Lo mismo ocurría a través de todo el perímetro, así que había más bulla de lo debido, pero pronto las cosas se aquietaron y después de algunos minutos miraba los campos de arroz que se extendían como un cementerio más allá de mi mirada. Había hecho esto antes, a veces bajo mucha más presión, pero la marihuana vietnamita me tenía en su agarre y estaba un poco mareado y agradecido de poderme sentar. Necesitaba enfocarme, así que miré fijamente en la oscuridad para cuadrar mi visión nocturna. Al comienzo, apenas distinguía la línea entre donde terminaban los campos de arroz y empezaba el cielo, pero a medida que mis ojos se acostumbraron a la oscuridad, pude ver otros detalles. Miré, sacudí mi cabeza y miré de nuevo. Veía un pelotón de soldados Vietcong moviéndose casi imperceptiblemente en mi dirección por la oscuridad, que también era la dirección donde estábamos todos nosotros, y mi deber sencillo de defender, mi deber sagrado de defender la zona de aterrizaje, lo cual hice con todo mi corazón. Tenía que alertar al tipo que seguía en la línea, pero no lo podía ver en la oscuridad y no quería hacer ruido, ni un sonido. El problema con las formas oscuras en los árboles de noche es que a veces son cuerpos. Miré fijamente de nuevo a los campos oscuros de arroz y metí mi nariz en el viento hasta que vi que los soldados Vietcong eran bueyes de agua. Yo también me pude calmar y volver a respirar. Pero ahí no termina la historia, porque alguien más abajo en la línea detonó unas minas a distancia cuando luces de bengala de aviso iluminaron el área a nuestro alrededor y escuché el chisporroteo de los rifles cerca y a lo largo de toda la línea. A medida que caían las luces entre nosotros, se veían las formas de los bueyes de agua en esa luz tan nítida, aquí y allá, y luego de repente desaparecidas. Sonaron un par de ráfagas más, y luego el silencio de nuevo, así que podía escuchar un bramido terrible que venía desde la oscuridad. Gritos agudos que para mí sonaban muy parecidos a dolor. Lo único que podía hacer era mantener mi posición y desear que lo que fuera se muriera rápido para que cesara el sonido de su agonizar, y para que quizás ahí terminara la cosa por esa noche. Son las asociaciones con otras cosas las que nos hacen recordar y por eso no nos sueltan, sin importarles lo que pensamos o lo que rezamos. El campesino encontró los cadáveres antes del amanecer y arrastró un ternero a nuestro búnker. Sus ojos todavía estaban abiertos y su mirada quieta me incluía en la dificultad en que estábamos todos. Yo tenía 18 años y sabía poco. Escuché voces rabiosas al fondo. Estaba involucrado el dinero. Luego se hicieron arreglos que permitirían que todos tuviéramos salvoconducto por la miseria y desperdicio en que la guerra se había convertido, pero yo no pensaba en eso. Yo pensaba en el berrido del ternero después que la mina lo volvió pedazos cuando activó las luces bengala con sus brincos juguetones a pocos pasos de un sendero antiguo que atravesaba el arroz. Esa voz sonaba tan humana, tan llena de ganas de paz, de cualquier especie.
Thank you. Tell them everything. Tell them everything, they said. Tell them about the sick hands of some evil people or the evil hands of some sick people. Tell them about the one who most betrayed, although a river appears now, so tell them about the river and forget her. Whitewater and fat shad wiggling in death at the ends of our gigs. 3 prongs and waist deep between rocks where we had to wade our way carefully. More than one of us drowned in that river. We sold the shad to a Russian neighbor who paid 10 cents a fish, and we were so fucking rich we didn't know what to do. Tell them what you did, they said. Can there be sin without punishment? I asked the father at catechism on Saturday. My parents too poor for Catholic school, and you had to learn the routine somewhere. I loved the father, and when I went to war, he wrote to me once a month. But that Saturday morning, when I longed only to be on a baseball field or in the arms of Sister Mary Catherine, fat chance of that, he told me that there were questions better left unasked. He didn't say unanswered, as I had expected, but unasked. I was disappointed nearly to tears, although he never knew that. Afterwards, I stayed inside the church alone. I wanted to pray, but nothing would come to my lips or to my heart, which felt heavy for the first time. I could still hear the stern voice of the Father warning me about questions my life depended upon me, asking, if you have the need to know, there's nothing you could do except open a vein and bleed it out of you. Tell them about the bleeding, they said, as if it was easy to pull a hook from a fish's gills. Dome of blue sky is all that we have left between us and one catastrophe or another to wipe it all out. That's all right with me. Blue sky beyond a green line of old trees bending into the breeze but never letting go. Beyond the small house and its many lives that come and go like bats to the last river in the night. Tell them about the night, about the church bells that won't stop ringing, so many dead, the rope pulled morning to dusk, no rest for anyone. I wanted to pray under the dome of blue sky, but nothing would come to my lips. And I think it must feel like when a spirit or something like a spirit dies inside of you.
Cuéntales todo. Cuéntales todo, dijeron. Cuéntales de las manos enfermas de alguna gente mala o de las manos malas de alguna gente enferma. Cuéntales de la que más traicionó, aunque ahora aparece un río, así que diles del río y olvídate de ella. Aguas blancas y los sábalos gordos retorciéndose en las puntas de nuestras lanzas. 3 puntas y hasta la cintura entre las rocas donde tuvimos que entrar con cuidado. Más de uno de nosotros se ahogó en ese río. Vendíamos los sábalos a un vecino ruso que pagaba 10 centavos por cada pez y estábamos tan putamente ricos que no sabíamos qué hacer. Cuéntales lo que hiciste, dijeron. ¿Existirá pecado sin castigo? Le pregunté al padre en el catequismo el sábado. Mis padres sin con qué pagar un colegio católico y uno se tenía que aprender la rutina en alguna parte. Yo al padre lo estimé y cuando me fui a la guerra, él me escribía una vez al mes, pero ese sábado en la mañana, cuando yo quería solo estar jugando béisbol o estar en los brazos de la hermana Mary Catherine, poca posibilidad de eso. Él me dijo que hay preguntas que mejor no se hacen. No dijo que no se deben responder, como yo pensaba que iba a decir, sino que mejor no se hacen. Mi decepción me llevó casi a las lágrimas, pero él nunca se dio cuenta. Luego me quedé en la iglesia solo. Quería rezar, pero nada llegaba a mis labios ni a mi corazón, que se sintió pesado por primera vez. Aún escuchaba la voz del Padre advirtiéndome que mi vida dependía de hacer ciertas preguntas. Si tienes la necesidad de saber, no hay nada más que hacer. Abra una vena y que salga en la sangre. Cuéntales de sangrar, dijeron, como si fuera fácil sacar el anzuelo de las branquias del pez. Un domo de cielo azul es lo único que nos queda y nos separa, y una u otra catástrofe que aniquilará todo, pero yo no tengo problema. Cielo azul más allá de una línea verde de árboles viejos que se doblan bajo el viento, pero nunca soltaban, más allá de una casa pequeña y sus muchas vidas que van y vienen como murciélagos al último río en la noche. Cuéntales acerca de la noche, acerca de las campanas de la iglesia que no paraban de sonar, tantos muertos que se aló el lazo de la campana de mañana hasta el atardecer, sin descanso para alguien. Querría rezar bajo el domo de cielo azul, pero nada llegaba a mis labios, y creo que así se siente cuando algo parecido a un espíritu muere dentro de uno.
The final poem I want to read is called Living in a City Without Guns, and it's a poem that I wrote in Hanoi, Vietnam last winter during my 3 months there. The votive paper fire burns for the recent dead, lighting up this Hanoi street corner as the sun goes down. It gets dark early here in spring, and a light mist of rain called Mưa Xuân hangs like a lace curtain over everything. I don't know much about death, although I have seen more than my share. I'm certain of that. I don't know much about longing either, although I had believed it was longing that kept me unfulfilled. The lily pad is never unfulfilled, nor is the wren whose small song you could hear even deep in the forest. Yet these are all only thoughts, aren't they? Things that bounce around through space like tiny satellites for the grief-stricken souls who can never go home. What a frightful place that we inhabit. What a place to raise your kids. More guns than people, and little to hold them back. Thank you.
Bueno, dice el poeta que este es su último poema y su nombre es La una inmaculada Brin de la quietud, y fue un poema que él escribió durante el invierno en el último año que estuvo en Vietnam.
Bueno, en realidad el poema se llama Living in a City Without Guns, vivir en una ciudad sin armas de fuego, y dice: las llamas arden del papel de ofrenda para los recién muertos, iluminando esta esquina en Hanoi mientras anochece. Aquí se oscurece temprano en la primavera y una brizna llamada Mưa Xuân cuelga sobre todo como una cortina bordada. No sé mucho acerca de la muerte, aunque he visto más de lo normal. De eso estoy seguro. Tampoco sé mucho acerca de añorar, aunque había creído que era la añoranza la razón que siempre sentía un vacío. Nunca se siente insatisfecho un nenúfar, ni el reyezuelo cuyo canto diminutivo se escucha aún en las profundidades del bosque. Pero todo esto son solo pensamientos, ¿no es cierto? Cosas que rebotan por el espacio como pequeños satélites para las almas en luto que nunca podrán volver a casa. Qué sitio tan espantoso el que habitamos. Qué sitio es este para criar los hijos, más armas que personas y poco que las pueda detener.
Kyo, thank you very much for those beautiful translations.
Muchas gracias por esas hermosas traducciones, dice el poeta.
A Bruce, muchas gracias.
Yes.
Muchas gracias, Bruce, por tus generosos poemas.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Y gracias, Santiago, por la traducción. Quisiera conversar contigo en este momento.
So Bruce, we would like to thank you very much for your poetry, and we would like to have a short dialogue with you.
Of course.
So we will ask. We would like to ask you some questions regarding your poetry, your work in general.
Of course.
Gracias. Bruce, sus poemas dan testimonio de la fuerza arrasadora de la guerra, pero también de la belleza escondida o evidente de la condición humana cuando la tregua política no es una opción cercana. Perdón si caemos en un lugar común que quizá lo tenga un tanto cansado. Además, tal vez no es fácil recordar la guerra ni sobrevivir a ella para contarla. Pero quisiera preguntarle, mientras fue soldado, ¿recuerda algún momento en particular donde la poesía se le haya presentado como una epifanía?
So I guess people have asked you a lot regarding this moment of your life about the war, but he would like to ask you if poetry came to you during those times as a form of epiphany. Did it have any effect on you during that time of your life?
You know, I was 18 years old when I went to war, and I was not someone who spent a lot of time reading poetry at the time. Although my experience in the war caused me many problems later on in my life, I'm always grateful for that experience because it's that experience that gave me poetry. I went inside of myself and to look for some answers. And when I went inside, I found poetry.
Bueno, dice el poeta que pues, en realidad él estaba muy joven cuando participó en la guerra, él tenía 18 años y en ese momento pues él no tenía como ninguna relación con la poesía. Sin embargo, esa experiencia de la guerra pues lo marcó a él bastante, le produjo un montón de problemas que lo llevó, pues eso lo llevó a él a buscar una serie de respuestas. Y dentro de esas respuestas, pues uno de los asuntos a los que terminó llegando fue precisamente a la poesía.
Maravilloso. Quisiera preguntarle algo más. ¿Cómo ha sido su aproximación a Vietnam y a su poesía?
So he would like to ask you another question. How has been your approach to the Vietnamese culture and in particular to the Vietnamese poetry?
Yes, and I went back to Vietnam in 1986 as a guest, and I left that trip hoping that there was something that I could do for Vietnam. So I began to study the language and to work with Vietnamese poets, translating Vietnamese poetry into English and then publishing it here in the United States to try to bring some understanding to the American people about the rich and very old culture that Vietnam has. So my experience initially was in a war, but I've been there many, many times since then and have spent months there at a time now. And now it's as a poet, spending time with my fellow poets in Hanoi, in Vietnam. So I'm very fortunate to have had that experience because it goes a long way in salving the guilt that I felt as a soldier.
Bueno, dice el poeta que él regresó en 1986 a Vietnam y pues con unos deseos muy sinceros de redimirse, de hacer algo pues por ese país al que él siente pues que le hizo daño siendo un soldado norteamericano. Y pues que una de las cosas que él hizo, pues además de estudiar el idioma, fue empezar, digamos, como a reunirse con poetas de allá de Vietnam, a traducir su poesía, a introducir, digamos, esa poesía y esa cultura también a los mismos Estados Unidos, como para volverlo, para que fuera conocido. Y que bueno, pues que ya ha pasado un tiempo desde eso, desde esas reuniones con esos poetas en Hanoi y bueno, pues ya digamos se ha vuelto como una relación de hace varios años. Entonces esa es como la relación que él ha tenido, la aproximación y la relación que él ha tenido con la poesía vietnamita.
La guerra sigue siendo una amenaza para la humanidad. En ese sentido, le quiero preguntar, ¿cómo puede hoy la poesía contribuir al cambio de la historia humana?
So war is still a tremendous threat for human beings. How do you think that poetry can do something to solve this eternal problem that war is?
Yeah, that's a difficult question, of course, and I'm not sure that I have an answer, but I do know that poetry speaks against the darkness, that poetry raises us up above the trauma and above the terror of the war, even if only for a moment, even if it only happens during the moment that you're inside of the poem, reading the poem. But I think that's enough. I think that we can't demand too much from poetry. I wish that those who read war poems would understand fully the futility and the waste that war is, but I'm afraid that that doesn't happen, because if it did, then we would have stopped having wars a long time ago, and maybe after Homer wrote his great poem.
Pues él dice que no sabe si es capaz de responder esa pregunta, pero él sí sabe pues que la poesía, digamos, tiene como un tremendo poder de aliviar el dolor, de hablar en medio de la oscuridad y, bueno, digamos, puede cumplir, digamos, algún papel individual mientras, por ejemplo, se lee un poema, o sea, se pueden aliviar muchas heridas mientras se lee un poema, pero que igual él considera que la gente demanda demasiado de la poesía porque por desgracia, las guerras siempre van a estar ahí, la barbarie siempre va a estar ahí. Y aunque la poesía, digamos, sí podría jugar algún papel desde el punto de vista individual, pues, digamos, la poesía no podría, digamos, parar esta maquinaria.
Muy bien, tengo una cuarta y última pregunta. ¿Cómo ve Bruce los procesos culturales activos en Estados Unidos en este momento?
Okay, a last question. How do you see the cultural processes, the active cultural processes in the U.S. nowadays?
We're in the midst of a dramatic change, I hope. There are still many Americans who are uninformed about the culture and the country and the people of Vietnam, even though they sent their sons there to fight against the Vietnamese. Vietnam, fortunately, has reached out to the United States on the level of literature. And there are many literary exchanges now between the poets of Vietnam and the poets and writers of the United States. So hopefully that broader understanding can come. Poetry matters because it teaches us disciplined emotion. And that's something that's cross-cultural. That's something that's relevant and significant to every culture. That and it tells us a righteous version of historical events in these troubled times. It's a version of history, I think, no matter what culture you're talking about, that is probably most truthful about that culture.
Bueno, pues él se está refiriendo un poco, pues, digamos, como al conocimiento que tienen, pues, como estos poetas jóvenes respecto de Vietnam. Él dice que todavía hay mucha ignorancia, mucho desconocimiento respecto a este gran país, pues, que digamos ha sido como su gran preocupación a lo largo de su vida. Y él dice, pues, que todavía hay mucho que aprender, de países como Vietnam, pues, en Estados Unidos, un país como Vietnam que ha avanzado tanto desde el punto de vista literario, que ha avanzado tanto desde el punto de vista de la poesía, y que tiene tanto que ofrecerle a Estados Unidos desde el punto de vista, pues, o sea, desde lo que puede hacer la poesía, porque la poesía, dice Bruce, que digamos, nos enseña mucho acerca de la forma en la que podemos interpretar nuestras emociones y nos ayuda a entender nuestras realidades, todo tipo de realidades.
Muy bien. Bruce, otra pregunta adicional, nos disculpas. Quisiéramos saber, ¿tú cómo defines tu propia poesía? ¿Cómo es ese encuentro con tus propios poemas y cómo puedes definirlo?
A final question, Bruce. How do you define your own poetry? How do you define, in general, your poetic work?
I like to use Carolyn Forcher's famous phrase, the poetry of witness. I think of the poet as a witness.
Ok. Que le gusta mucho, pues, una frase de alguien que acabo de mencionar que dice, la poesía es un testigo, que esa es como su manera de ver las cosas. La poesía atestigua algo.
Muy bien, muchas gracias, Bruce. Ha sido muy generoso con sus respuestas, igualmente con sus poemas. En este momento quisiera invitar al público, al poeta Bruce también y a Santiago para que leamos algunos de los comentarios del público que están en este momento conectados. Dice, Klaus Ankersen dice, thank you, Bruce, wonderful twist, great piece.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you all so much. I appreciate it. I hope to see you soon in Medellín.
Edith Elvira Colqui Rojas nos escribe una vez más presente para espectar el Festival de la Palabra. Iván Sopeses Álvarez nos escribe buenas noches desde Madrid. Luz Elena Sepúlveda, buenas tardes, festival, y saludos especiales a todo el equipo técnico, más traductores y lectores de las voces del mundo. Awendea nos escribe un día más de poesía, Norteamérica, con poetas que tienen tanto por decir. Y Esther Lucía Zuleta, Colorado, dice gracias Prometeo por regalarnos tanta belleza en esta tarde.
Thank you.
Y a ti, Bruce, muchas gracias por estar con nosotros en la tarde de hoy. Invitamos al público para que nos sigan enviando mensajes, para que nos escriban a través de las redes sociales con el numeral FIPM 30 años. También para que ingresen a la página del festival www.festivaldepoesiademedellin.org. Allí la revista Prometeo, organizadora del Festival Internacional de Poesía, pues los invita a adquirir las memorias y también para que sigan los eventos que ya han pasado y los que están por venir. Hoy, recuerden también, a las 7 de la noche, hora Colombia, tendremos al poeta vietnamita Nguyen Quan Thu, quien estará hablando, contando, estará inspirando a través de la poesía vietnamita nuestros propios corazones. Así que recuerden, a continuación, yo me despido ya en este momento, pero a continuación los vamos a dejar con la memoria audiovisual de estos 30 años de festival. Muchas gracias por estar con nosotros y nos vemos. Hasta pronto.
El imposible realizado. 30º Festival Internacional de Poesía de Medellín.
Sing song. When I was young, the moon spoke in riddles and the stars rhymed. I was a new toy waiting for my owner to pick me up. When I was young, I ran the day to its knees. There were trees to swing on, crickets for capture. I was narrowly sweet, infinitely cruel, tongued in honey and coddled in milk, sunburned and silvery and scabbed like a colt. And the world was already old, and I was older than I am today.
Toa ya ai za, toa ha zi za, toa sha a ha zi. Hau no jo ta, pitya ya ai, pitya ha zi. Ju cha yao ha zi, ju ota ha zi. Ya ai shu tai kui ya, ha zi shu tai kui ya. Kotra cha tsema shu tai kui ya. Doa eme haus au yu pe ni e shau pe ta. Doa eme shau pe ta, e au yu pe ni.
The shapes of leaves. Ginkgo, cottonwood, pin oak, sweet gum, tulip tree. Or emotions resemble leaves and alive to their shapes we are nourished. Have you felt the expanse and contours of grief along the edges of a big Norway maple? Have you winced at the orange flare searing the curves of a curling dogwood? I have seen from the air logged islands, each with a network of branching gravel roads, and felt a moment of pure anger, aspen gold. I have seen sandhill cranes moving in an open field, a single white whooping crane in the flock. And I have traveled along the contours of leaves that have no name. Here, where the air is wet and the light is cool, I feel what others are thinking and do not speak. I know pleasure in the veins of a sugar maple. I am living at the edge of a new leaf.
Saadşınşlı, saadigini şınşlı, saadigini dişınşlı, Hore yana hunşlı, Adana hunşlı, Dice hunşlı, Ahoyel ago hunşlı, Iskago hunşlı. Saadşınşlı, saadigini şınşlı, saadigini dişınşlı. Şen zaha kes, şen tıta, şen zohodezın şeyat ki, She nahat she inna. Sa chinshne, sa digini shinshne, sa digini di shinshne. She nache nta kes at ate, she nache sin at ate, she nache torizin at ate, she nache sad at ate, she nache all in at ate. Sa shinshne, sa digini shinshne. Sa digini di shinshne. All in atras eiste, atras eiste, atras eiste. Die ben je nog kaarten nebat en stan nog kaarten net, die je nog kaarten net, ilini nog kaarten net zo bij. Die ben je daar has is in not on the nesko eindes. Die ben je nog kaarten nebat en sta. Sa shinshne, sa digini shinshne sa tigini di shinshne. Ahoyel ago hunshlo is kago hunshlo, DJ hunshlo atana hunshlo, hode yana hunshlo, sad shinshne sa tigini di shinshne, sa tigini di shinshne.
Turtle, tortuga. 1. We are speaking inside the nervous system without nerve endings to call our own. Children born with teeth chewing into incubators, not knowing walls or the beating hearts of an owl hovering over the gates in her belly. Atop the white shell, dangling, cursed, quiet, waiting for these chains to be snapped in half by the beaks of awakened turtles. 2. We turn in their beds, eyes the colors of faded maps, when the story calls through the cut in the north ceiling. Outside the door, we blow songs over its warm stomach, but it doesn't soften or crumble into bread. Its palms don't bleed when hammered to the floor either. It wants to leap into the night without a torch or flashlight, but the fire removes its skin and clamps back its eyelids. A memory is wrung from the sheets of a hospital bed. 3. While laying face down, the footsteps climb to the surface of the map. The snake bit back the knife of the witness who shook through the keyhole of a burning house after dragging the moon sister across the floor of her amphitheater. It took him a year to forget.
This is my heart. It is a good heart. Weaves a membrane of mist and fire, and we make love in the flower world. My heart is close enough to sing to you in a language too clumsy for human words. This is my head. It is a good head. Whirrs inside with a swarm of worries. What is the source of this mystery? Why can't I see it right here, right now? As real as these hands hammering the world together. This is my soul. It is a good soul. It tells me, come here, forgetful one. And we sit together. We cook a little something to eat. Then a sip of something sweet. For memory, for memory. This is my song. It is a good song. Walked forever the border of fire and water. Climbed ridges of desire to sing to you. Its new wings quiver with vulnerability. Come lie next to me. Put your head here. My heart is close enough to see.
The New York poem. I sit in the dark, not brooding exactly, not waiting for the dawn that is just beginning at 6:21, the gray October light behind the trees. I sit, breathing, mind turning on its wheel. Hayden writes, "What use is poetry in times like these?" And I suppose I understand what he says. A poet simply cannot comprehend any meaning in such slaughter. Nevertheless, in the grip of horror, I turn to poetry, not prose, to help me come to terms, such as can be, with the lies, murders, and breathtaking hypocrisies of those who would lead a nation or a church. What use is poetry? I sat down September 12th, 2001 in the Common Era and read Rumi and kissed the ground. And now that millions starve in the name of holy war, every war is holy. It is the same pathetic story from which we derive biblical proportion. I hear Pilate's footsteps ring on cobblestone, the voice of Joe McCarthy cursing in the Senate, Fat Boy exploding as the whole sky shudders. In New York City, the crashes and subsequent collapses created seismic waves. To begin to speak of the dead, of the dying, how can a poet speak of proportion anymore at all? Yet, as the old Greek said, we walk on the faces of the dead. The dark fall sky grows blue. Alone among ash and bones and ruins, Dufu and Washoe write the poem. The last trace of blind rage fades, and a mute sadness settles in like dust for the long, long haul. But if I do not get up and sing, if I do not get up and dance again, the savages will win. I'll kiss the sword that kills me if I must.
I was raised in a traditional Cheyenne home by my grandparents. And they were involved in the ceremony of the Native American Church, which uses the sacrament peyote. And from the age of 3, I was taken into this teepee for the prayers and meditations and healings that occurred. The imagery of those healings in a child's mind were profound. And as I grew into my teenage years, I continued the ceremonies, which then included the Sundance, which is another Cheyenne ceremony. And throughout my teenage life, I was surrounded and nurtured by the Cheyenne people, who are my people.
I want to salute my brothers here. My people, the Cheyenne, greet you in peace and solidarity. Viva Colombia.
Well, my life was immersed in ceremony and ritual as a child. And as I grew into manhood, I had the military. I was a U.S. Marine. And then after the Marines, I went to university. And it was in university that I began to seriously consider myself a poet. In fact, my first book of poetry was published in my second year as a student in university. And I was one of 19 Native American poets discovered by Harper and Row Publishers of New York, and I appeared in the very first Native American anthology with 18 other Native poets, carriers of the dream wheel. That said, the influence of ritual and ceremony have stayed with me all of my life, and I return home every year for ceremonies. I'm fluent in my language. I carry the medicines that I have earned in ritual and ceremony, and I live my life as a poet and a cultural activist.
Here in Syria, all the gods are dead. Children fold the brightest parts of themselves inside as if they are still alive.
I come from a community that is traumatized by American injustice. Regarding tribal life in America, most recently at Standing Rock in South Dakota, where thousands of Native Americans gathered to protect the river. My life as a poet and as a person is dedicated to resisting oppression of any form that would harm indigenous people.
In my Cheyenne tribe, who has suffered 500 years of oppression by an invader government, we say, the heart of our nation will not be on the ground so long as the hearts of our women are alive. This poem for Berta Chacheres, a Honduran activist who lost her life defending a river. A river has no name. The sound it knows of wind and moonlight, its singing self, its long memory, bereft of longing, full of human invasion, human crossings, animal crossings, rests in its essential movements. Shaman, no, it is possible for a river to sing inside a soul. It is you, Berta Chacheres.
There are a lot of poets who don't do that kind of work, that kind of mythological searching in their own lives. The poets who I respect are involved with not only their own cultural references, but involved in the world community of indigenous people. And it is those poets who I admire and who I read and who have influenced me. I think the purpose of poetry is an ancient calling. The first speakers coming out of the cave era, interpreting storms and wind and the phenomenon of weather and the phenomenon of survivance, were the first poets, the first seers, and they were considered sacred beings. They were considered the doctors, the healers, both women and men in their specific cultures. Poetry belongs to that origin, and it is to that I feel honored to be a poet.
A young girl sings in the green light, songs of leaves on the river, evening rain. She strains to keep time with the boy beside her who fights the feedback from his bass. Her voice, so clear and fine, balances the strength of her song high out over the audience, men, women, children, drawn to the hall by the songs piped out over loudspeakers hung high in the trees. Her teacher stands nervously to the side in a brown rumpled suit and tie. The boy before him slips another filter into the spotlight, changing the halo circling the singer from red to green, exposing a cracked plaster wall, a display of children's paintings, scenes of boats drifting on blue rivers, mountain villages suspended under October moons. The sadness of autumn gathers here. I remember your words. Hope is an unharvested field.
The world and its leaders must come to know and recognize the role of art, culture, music, poetry in making peace. As one who was once a soldier, I know that peace will never come at the end of a gun, and that violence only begets more violence in an endless cycle that consumes itself and us all. Dioxin song. Somewhere in the sky, their healthy bodies float above us. Somewhere they swim in an air better than any we will ever know. The chemical scent gone, the burning. Children sent back this time to live in their true bodies, their pure, unsullied bodies. Nothing in their cells but the clear waters they see falling at the edge of the skies. How many of them, how many each day slipping out from flesh, children born into those twisted forms, children with fins where arms ought to be, toes and legs sprouting like flowers from their chests. In a film, I watched two boys with giant heads, heavy ovoid eyes, snouts for noses, sit gently before a thatched house in a village. 18 and 20 years old, still posed like children, they edged in close beside their father, who spoke with absolute calm about the ways he cared for them. Moments later, a young woman with clear, dark eyes leaned forward, tried to smile, but couldn't. All through the interview, she struggled patiently to get her two daughters, born without eyes, to sit up straight on the mat beside her. What many forms love takes. A friend told me once the story of the birth of his first child, how he climbed the wall of the hospital so he could look in on his wife. He was so filled with joy, he said, to see it healthy. He was halfway home before he realized he hadn't checked to see if it was a boy or a girl. He asked if I had ever seen the fetuses kept in the jars in the hospitals in the South, those babies with the wizened faces staring out through the yellow glaze of formaldehyde. The image of their gorgon heads, their humped and fish-like torsos woke him up at night, he said. Somewhere they too float in the sky above us. Somewhere what doesn't die lives on in silent rage. In Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Serbia, Bosnia, Ireland, I've seen landscapes devastated, lives destroyed. I met victims of torture, families who've endured incredible suffering. And in my own life, I have witnessed the death of my friends on the battlefield and seen others survive to come home only to take their own lives, and later seen they and their families suffer from terrible illnesses, from exposure to toxins that have been let loose out into the world. On 1 Kiem. Night and the woman moved through the streets in silk-cut dresses, sleeveless arms beckon, bared legs slash through crowds at stoplights, sandals lift a body weightless forever in the air. Around the lake, lights of oncoming cars move dragon-eyed in dusk. This city's soft geomancy of love, as if life were only a matter of bodies and spaces, there for the light to sing. But I have seen the power of poetry and humanity at work. I have seen veterans from different sides of wars sit down together to write poetry. I have seen young women poets from all sides of the recent war in the former Yugoslavia, from Bosnia, Serbia, Croatia, traveling together, reading their poems and meeting other young women in each of those places once, and in many still ways, so divided. I have seen young Palestinian children in camps make films about their lives, about lemonade stands, about living among unexploded bombs. I have seen the power of art and poetry to join people together, to advance the cause of peace, and to do that hard soul work of healing. That poem is about memory and forgetfulness, and this next poem is it's called First Casualty.
El poema anterior es sobre la memoria y el olvido, y este poema que sigue a continuación se llama La Primera Baja.
It's about the first dead body I saw as a soldier in the war. And there's a saying that after the first death, all the rest are numbers. And anyone who's been in a war knows that's not true, that those casualties walk through our sleep, they walk through the streets, they walk through the squares at night, begging for peace.
Dice que este poema se trata sobre el primer cuerpo muerto que vio en la guerra, y dicen que después del primero que uno ve, los demás son solamente números, y a él le parece que esto no es verdad, que esos muertos lo persiguen a uno en los sueños, en las calles, en las plazas, y están entre nosotros buscando la paz.
This is for all those casualties. First casualty. They carried him slowly down the hill. One hand hung, gray and freckled. No one spoke but stared straight up. His body heavy, rolled back and forth on the litter. At Elsie, Sharon cook spooned the last hot food. One by one, the squad walked back uphill. Don't mean nothing, someone said. But all that winter and into spring, I swear he followed us, his soul a surplus trailing the jungle floor.
Kevin quiere decir que este poema es para todas esas bajas de la guerra.
El imposible realizado. 30º Festival Internacional de Poesía de Medellín.